This is Delhi. Please stand by for our next program. This is All India Radio. In our national program of talks tonight, we bring you our panel discussion entitled Net Zero and Global Warming. The panelists are Sagari Chhabra, acclaimed filmmaker and author, Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, fellow, Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and Ravi Kumar, media personality who initiates and moderates this discussion. Net Zero and Global Warming.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently said that the climate change situation was nothing less than a code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable. In tonight's national program of talks, we will discuss the world's response to these alarm bells. We will discuss net zero and global warming. We've all been hearing the terms global warming and climate change for well over 2 decades. Now the term net zero has gone viral all over the world, and all Indians were introduced to the term 50 days ago when Prime Minister Modi gave a target for India to achieve the target of net zero by the year 2070. What is net zero? How realistic the goal is? How developed countries should help the developing countries financially and technologically to achieve the goal of net zero? These are some of the questions we will be looking at. With me in the studio are Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, fellow CEEW, Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Vaibhav is an economist and leads CEEW's long-term energy and climate modeling work. Welcome, Dr. Chaturvedi.
Thank you.
Sagari Chhabra is an award-winning author and film director. She was awarded the World Food Day Award by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations for the film Global Warming. Welcome, Sagari.
Thank you.
Let's begin by trying to understand the term net zero. Dr. Chaturvedi, tell us.
So net zero is essentially about the plus and the minus. We need to understand both. The plus is essentially the emissions that are growing in the atmosphere as a result of the lifestyles that the human beings and the economies have undertaken. So essentially when people start becoming rich, they buy more cars, they buy more air conditioners, and that is really, whether we like it or not, that is what really is seen around the world, and that's also happening in India. Now, this leads to a lot of emissions. They essentially, as we grow richer, our emissions footprints grow. But at the same time, there is also the minus. The minus is essentially through changes in lifestyle, through adopting more sustainable lifestyle, through adopting more technology solutions. Are we able to, either capture the emissions or reduce the emissions? For example, if you replace coal by solar energy, that is a technology solution for replacing or reducing emissions. If you are able to grow more trees, they actually sequester carbon. So that is also a minus. So a lot of these things, when they come together, essentially you have to think about the plus and the minus, and collectively they'll kind of lead to net zero.
Ms. Chhabra, the natural way to achieve zero is to reduce emissions, and one of the things that Vaibhav mentioned was sustainable lifestyle. And you have some interesting views on that the reason that we have reached this situation, you were mentioning that you made a film in 1989. And if we had paid attention to these things, we had taken these seriously, then we wouldn't have been in this situation today. Tell us more about it.
Well, I had the privilege and honor of making a documentary film, Global Warming, in 1989. And when I interviewed Dr. Paul Ehrlich, who was at that time at Stanford University, and now, of course, he's no more, and there's a Paul Ehrlich Institute of Climate Change at Yale named after him. He said, and I have this in the film, and I quote from him, "The Western model is a model of maldevelopment, and we are copying that." Now, it makes me feel very sad that we have gone whole hog towards copying that model of modernity. We think it is progress when we are in a big car. I mean, look at Delhi, for instance, become the most polluted city in the world. But it wasn't like this earlier. Can you and I walk? Can our children, our respective kids, cross the street? Schools are closing down because of pollution. So we need to look at a more indigenous, alternative, sustainable model of development. And between India and China, we have half the world's population located here. And I am always influenced by a little book that I read. It's written by Bapu, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. It's called Hind Swaraj. And the last lines of that book, and I quote from it, he writes, "I am not an enemy of the British, but I am of its civilization." Unquote. We need to re-examine what we think is civilization, what we think is development. And we have the faculties, we have the critical abilities.
So, Sagari, that's a more philosophical take and probably a more long-term. if we were to actually put that into action, what, when we were talking before the program started, Vaibhav was mentioning, what is the alternative?
The first thing that we can actually do is stop making these huge mega dams that dislocate the tribal population, that take up miles of land as backwaters and are prone to flooding. We need to look at sustainable models of energy, which means solar energy. Every rooftop can become, you can place solar panels and you can feed to the grid and you can earn money and you can get your free electricity.
Yeah.
We need wind energy. We have a huge coastal line. Every village could have a biogas plant because we have such a huge bovine population of cows. And, use that slurry and generate, the energy we need. And we'll go back to the individual changes that we can make in our lifestyle. But I think, Vaibhav, you wanted to say something.
Yes. I think you're making a very interesting point. And in fact, you highlighted a trade-off. Very interesting trade-off when you talked about hydropower. Hydropower is low carbon. But the other side is it leads to a lot of devastation of environment and social issues, right? This is exactly the trade-off that we are facing. Because of the displacement issues, environmental issues, hydropower needs to be kind of stalled. And I completely agree with that.
We can have smaller dams.
Smaller dam, that is also in the pipeline. So you're right, that's in the pipeline.
Smaller. Think small is beautiful.
But there's limited potential for these kind of technology. So the technical assessments have told us that the large potentials are always with large hydropower, which we should not go ahead with. A smaller one will have always lower potential. If you look at India's per capita electricity consumption, it is around 1100 kilowatt hours per capita. This is India's, okay? The developed world, median values would be around 7,000 to 8,000. In fact, US is very unsustainable. It is around 14,000.
Let's hold that thought for a while. You wanted to complete on other ways that you could probably cut down emissions and other thoughts apart from, you mentioned renewable energy, solar and wind. Any other thoughts for an alternative model? Any other ideas?
Absolutely. I mean, from starting let's get the big cars off the road. Let's think of mass transit. And, buses from the point where you get off and when you have to get home. If you can't possibly be walking these clogged streets. We need those electric operated buses. Let all kids, take school buses. We used to do that. I see a pile up of cars outside when I go to pick up my child. I mean, in the sense that, if we want to simplify our lives, if we want to make simplicity elegant, then that is the way to go. Look at clothes. If you choose handloom clothes, you are giving that weaver employment in his own village. You're wearing something sustainable. Your own skin is breathing. And when you discard those clothes, the earth can breathe. It's time we see the earth as a living thing and not an inert object from which we are going to extract something. We need a nurturing economy, not an extractive economy. We need to live in a way that we can see each other as human beings and not assess each other from the amount of money you're making and the amount of power you have and be fearful of that.
Yeah.
We are sitting around the table as equals. We have to framework.
Sorry to interject here. I think these are very important points you're making, and I think nobody would disagree with that in terms of principles and philosophy. We have to understand the political economy of the transition. That is the reality of it. So nobody would disagree. I mean, people are aspirational. They are, for whether we like it or not. And the aspiration, the way they measure aspirations, is a car and air conditioner and an international flight.
That was not the way India was earlier.
You're right.
This
but
is
it
a
is the way.
product of the advertising industry.
It
and
might
we
be.
have followed this model after the 90s when we became so-called globalized. So can we reconsider this model is my humble suggestion.
Yes.
That's all.
But please tell us a practical sort of roadmap of what does it mean in practice, because we have never seen it actually. To be very frank with you, we have never seen it. Your philosophy is right, principles are right. I want to see a roadmap, which we have not seen yet. Till we don't see this alternative actually roadmap.
Let us look at what changes we can make with what we buy or what we consume.
So now, we will come to the individual level
we'll come
later.
to that.
But Sagari clearly making an impassioned case for sustainable lifestyle and going back to the Hind Swaraj concept that Bapu gave us. But moving forward to the topic that we are looking at in terms of how do we move forward. So they say for a cancer to be in remission, it has to stop growing at the least. If you look at carbon emission as a cancer, before we get to net zero, we have to stop growing in terms of the emission.
Yes.
That means we have to peak. Vaibhav, if we have to achieve net zero at some point in time, we need a target for peaking of emissions since we are still growing in terms of emissions as a nation. So do we have that target?
Well, we don't have a target yet, but it's all about, after the Glasgow announcement, we are also expected, each country is expected to submit something called a long-term strategy. So in a long-term strategy, every country will be expected to take some intermediate targets. So this is expected to come maybe in a couple of years. So we will have intermediate targets. The intermediate targets will give us a very good sense of when the economy, when the government has officially put when the economy is expected to peak. But going by our research, CEEW's research and all, we do expect we will have to peak somewhere around 2040 to 45. Only then you will be able to achieve net zero by 2070. Because I always say that in India's economy is like a pretty big airplane. It's not a two-wheeler that, so when you have an airplane, the turning radius is very high, which means you have to, there's so many systems that need to be changed across the whole economy. That it cannot be that we peak in 2060 and we achieve net zero in 2070. It is not a 10-year thing. It's a pretty long thing. And that's why somewhere around 2040 to 45 is what we expect to peak. But let me say it is the political economy, as I said, is going to be a big challenge. And there are many different angles of political economy. One is this lifestyle thing. In fact, the Prime Minister also in his speech, he devoted so much time for lifestyle, this lifestyle. Because it is critical, absolutely critical. There is no disagreement. I think everybody around the world says that it is very critical. But when we look around the world, when you look at actual policies, what need to be done, we are actually not able to make a great progress, which is unfortunate. Unfortunately, we are not able to make a great progress on that particular aspect, which is also political economy. How do you change an individual consumer's mind, right? That is one thing. Second is, what do you do with these investments which have happened, in the past, right? These companies and all that are invested, in fact, 3 states of India derive so much in terms of employment, in terms of fiscal revenues from the coal economy. Now, you have, ultimately that's a reality. You have to somehow make them, ensure that these states move to some different form, maybe a tourism-based economy or whatever it is. But these are real challenges, which is essentially the political economy of the transition. Now, so real challenges at the individual level, which is about the lifestyle, but also the economy level where big investments have happened from the state level, but also the big businesses. And 2070 appears to be pretty long. But let me say, when I buy a car as an individual, it is like, I would say, maybe 8-10 years is what I use the car for. So the decision horizon and is 8-10 years. After that, maybe I can buy an electric car, which is much more sustainable, right? Compared to that, if businesses make a decision, their gestation period is 30, 40, 50 years. So 2070 net zero essentially means no coal power plant in India could come after 2030. We already know it because the technical life of a coal power plant is 40 years. So if you get a coal power plant in 2040, it simply means you will have to shut it down 10 years before the technical lifetime. You will be forced to do that because of the net zero target, right? So these businesses have very long gestation investment, and net zero essentially is a very strong policy signal to make them move, do early decision making right now, because this people part of it has been very, very challenging. This large point sources, the business part of it is something where we have levers to move things around in a much faster way. So 2070 for India, for a fast growing economy, is not at all very easy, let me say.
In fact, you mentioned that the moment you give 2070 as a target, you immediately get a certainty. And I was very pleasantly surprised out here in All India Radio. If you just go out to the parking, a month ago I came, the entire fleet of vehicles, which basically ferries the news personnel and the personnel, has all been converted to electric vehicles with charging stations. All some 20 odd vehicles, all the old vehicles were gone just in one fell swoop.
Yeah, but the best thing is to walk, no? So clear up the roads by giving us mass transit and having some electric buses that can get people to their own homes.
Which is what I'm coming to. So now you have a certainty. Will the investment follow? Because you have 2070 as a date when you're saying you have to be net zero. So will the industry also follow by putting in their money where the mouth is, and now they will have to.
I believe in the power of now. I mean, 2070, I don't know if I'm not going to be alive in 2070. I hope you will be. But the point is that, it's all very well to talk about 2070. Can we talk about it now? Because climate change is upon us right now.
On that point, Sagari, you have written a book, The Talking Tree, which is intended at kids. And it's a book which is in verse with illustrations. So you have this very powerful skill of communicating to kids. And he mentioned that 2070, although seems very far away, is still challenging. And you're saying 2070, I'm not going to see. So it clearly comes out that for 2070 to be a reality, it's almost 2.5 generations away. We have to start communicating to kids, which you are an expert on. Talking Tree is a great example where you basically say a tree is actually fighting against the builder and eventually the tree wins, and that kind of story. So tell us more about your skill in communicating to kids. How can we get this message across to kids?
I really urge kids to consider before they consume, what do they really need it? And I ask parents, why do you take your kids to big malls? And we need to stop making these big malls. They are megalomaniac structures. Supposing you have one short circuit and a fire starts. So many people will get asphyxiated. These are not sustainable. We need to have sustainable architecture with cross ventilation. We are talking about a time of COVID where we want ventilation. But look at the buildings we are setting up of glass, of steel. We need to think of what's good for the earth democracy. Every tree, every plant, every animal has a right to exist. And biodiversity is, we've entered the era of sixth extinction. So if we can make our kids before they consume, if they can just think what is the impact on yourself, on your community, and on the earth. We're not the only planet here, Earth is just one of the planets in the solar system. And we shouldn't start this colonization game. Colonizing Mars. Do we have water there? Getting to the moon, planting your flag there. Treat things as sacred. Treat things with life.
So your message to the kids is think before you consume, and I'm sure you'll come out with more books with illustrations and probably in verse focused on that message.
See ourselves as spiritual beings having a human life rather than a human life that is out to consume, and we can assess ourselves with the amount of gadgets we have. That's the advertising model that we are getting sucked into. They're trying to tell us that, you've not made it unless you've got a big car or you've got a big house. You're man enough before that.
Yeah. Okay. See, very important point. Let me also come back to one specific point that you raised, the mass transit. This is a very, very important issue. We should have it, completely agree. But let us also think about the experiment that BRTS. BRTS was exactly that in Delhi. They were trying to create a mass transit experiment. Mass transit infrastructure for people.
Fight between the buswalas and the carwalas.
That is what erupted. And in fact, what information is there, and that all the people who used to drive cars, ultimately they forced that experiment to fail.
Point of the matter is that we need to rethink this capitalist economy, this kind of thing of use and discard. Where is that old car? When you said a car should last 8 to 10 years, but if that car is going to be discarded after 10, where is it going?
Recycling. That's a new big industry that is already happening.
Let's come back to the global warming, and one of that is that, see, the developed countries, I believe most of the developed countries are having a net zero target of 2050.
Yes.
And most of them peaked 70 years before that.
Yes,
Let's say the UK peaked 75 years before that. So they had that kind of gap to bring it down after peaking.
Yes.
If you're saying we'll peak it by 2045, let's assume, we would probably have 25 years after peaking, and even Japan probably peaked 46 years before their net zero target comes up.
Yes.
So the developed countries have already grown at our expense, because even today India and China, she mentioned India and China are probably more than half of the world's population, or also more than half of the world's emission. So China alone contributes 25% of the world's emission. These people produce goods for the developed countries. So shouldn't the developed countries support India and developing countries through financing? And there has been this call for this $1 trillion of financing, which the developed countries are just kicking down the road. So how does the developed country help the developing countries in terms of, one, financing, and two, technological know-how?
Yes, so these are very important points, and the Prime Minister has also raised, he has asked to up the target from $100 billion to $1 trillion, because low-cost finance is one of the biggest challenges that India is already facing. If you look at, say, India's economy, India's one of the biggest national assets, which was coal, which was nationalized, Coal India Limited. Then you have NTPC, which produces power. That is also nationalized, a public sector undertaking, right? Not nationalized, but public sector undertaking. And then you have banks, many of them were nationalized. So see, the whole economy, the way it functioned in the last 40 years, is that NTPC will get priority access to this coal. This is already kind of a nationalized asset. NTPC is a PSU. Then it will get a low-cost interest from the same nationalized bank. Low-cost interest only represents that, the risk is much lower in this particular business, right? So now this is how the economy works. Now you're seeing new entrants like solar and all. Now these are in the new horizon sector, sunrise sectors, right? And they don't have that kind of access to capital the way the traditional, big players.
And let me interrupt you, because Sagari also mentioned renewable energy. We currently have installed capacity of 100 gigawatts, and the Prime Minister mentioned 500 gigawatts by 2030. But if you look at 2070 as a net zero target, I believe we need to have 7,500 gigawatts as the installed capacity. Is that even possible?
Well, there have to be many kinds of solutions that have to emerge. First of all, technology has to become better better and better. But it's like saying that now technology is coming where even your window can start generating solar. Right?
Really?
And yes, these technologies are there.
I can see the joy on Sagari's face.
And
she likes the idea.
You could see co-location strategies that are being talked about. For example, a farmer, as we know, we have somehow not managed to increase their income for so long, right?
And I think also I would like, as we think of new forms of energy, and of course we're talking about alternative lifestyles and an alternative model of development, I would like to humbly submit that we need to look and have a debate in the world about whether nuclear energy is actually a clean energy, because what are you going to do with the radioactive waste? What are you going to do if there's an accident? What are you going to do if there's an attack on it? Clean energy without looking at the long term. Because finally, global warming and climate change, you have to take a long-term view of it.
Correct.
Because of the burning of the fossil fuels and the greenhouse gases and the cap that has been created over the earth, the polar ice caps are melting, the sea level is rising, and coastal areas are inundated, and there is havoc. Okay, that is upon us. Of course, when I made this film in 1989, I had this, many people said, "Oh no, we don't think that global warming is there." I mean, but the point is now it's there. You can see it before you in the Uttarakhand tragedy, in the Malin village tragedy, in Chennai floods, Bangalore floods.
That's why the net zero target. That is why the net. Yeah, let's look at the financing. Let's
so you were mentioning that, and I was talking about that 100 billion being raised to 1 trillion in that latest demand for developing countries. Where is that money going to come, and why doesn't it come? For example, we were discussing before about this pandemic. All the central banks put out $32 trillion of money in asset purchase.
Yes.
And this is just 1 trillion you're talking about for the future of the earth.
Yes.
So do the developed countries not see this as a clear and present danger?
They do see, but it's ultimately it's the ills of the capitalistic system. So the trillions of dollars you talked about.
There, I think both Sagari and you would agree.
Yeah. So the $1 trillion you talked about in their own economies.
Right.
So it is still capitalism, but it's in their own development of their own economies.
Reality.
See, you have
as we come towards the ends, Vaibhav, is there anything technologically that is available which is tried and tested, which we can use? See, we have discussed a lot about reducing emissions, and we also talked briefly about the financing aspects and the challenges there. But is there something, a technology which can help us absorb these, that is available to India?
First of all, let me say trees are there. These trees are great for the environment in all kinds of ways, right? So that is there, but still it's not that that you could continue growing tree for perpetuity, right? So everything will have some sort of potential. So trees also have, but then technologically speaking, we have something called carbon capture and storage. There's new technology emerging, direct air capture. Of course, new technologies are emerging, but they're very expensive. Something extremely important for India is the question of affordability. We are, as I said, extremely, in terms of the people living around the poverty line, below or just above the poverty line, there are many. There's a huge low middle class. Affordability of electricity, in fact, as you would know, is a very important part of policy. And in fact, in many of the state elections, that is so upfront. We are sitting in Delhi, the richest state of India. Electricity is heavily subsidized here. Right?
And there is this cross subsidy. The industry ends up paying much more than the retail consumer.
Exactly.
Does that have to stop?
Well, it has to stop. The cross subsidy has to go away, because electrification of industrial energy is one of the most important elements in terms of the moving towards net zero. Right? Electrification cannot happen if electricity is so expensive, and it is so expensive because affordability is so important. So you subsidize residential and household consumer and agricultural consumer, and this is exactly the various elements of political economy. This is another. So I've talked about the coal economy. I've talked about the lifestyle. I'm talking about this third element, about the cross subsidy. Now you have to actually deal with all of these. And for an economy like India, we are not China. For an economy like India, you have to deal with these things, and you have to some time bite the bullet. And that is what the 50 years is for. For a growing economy, 50 years is actually extremely important for us to making these building blocks to ensure that we peak first and then we decline towards and actually achieve net zero without having shocks to the economy. That is very important. You don't want economy to be in a big shock. So that is why this 50 years.
I agree with you, Vaibhav, that we don't have to give a shock to the economy, and what we invest now or do now will have its impact 50 years later. But therefore, we need to set into process a certain sustainable model of development, which means, rethink, please, about your mega malls, about your big mega dams, about your huge, massive nuclear plants because something or the other is going to blow up in your face later on.
So let's assume this is a clear and present danger. And more companies are looking at net zero targets at the company level.
Yes.
Our own Indian Railways is looking at net zero by 2030. In fact, 1/5 of the world's top 2,000 largest public companies have committed to meet net zero targets.
Yeah.
So let's finally look at what can companies do to contribute and what can individuals do to contribute towards this eventual goal of net zero immediately, starting now. The moment they stop listening to this program, what can they start doing?
So first of all, many companies like Indian steel companies, they're already moving towards hydrogen in a big way because it is one of the solutions that is emerging very fast. Many Indian big companies with deep pockets have already put a lot of money on the table for research and development for finding that solution. That is one solution. For other companies that are there, which are heavily electricity dependent, they are already saying that I want to buy electricity that is only generated from renewable energy. So I won't buy electricity which is coal generated. I want to buy only solar and wind kind of thing, right? The third is that companies are already thinking of buying offsets. So if in the next, let's say 10 years, you are not able to get enough electricity from solar based on the location wherever you are, then you say, okay, I'm ready to pay much higher in terms of offsetting my emissions from the electricity that I'm buying, so that this money can go to some renewable energy developer somewhere in India, and they are able to generate. So there are different ways companies are already trying. But as I said, the more you move towards the future, after the peak year, then it's going to be increasingly challenging for companies to actually, there are many other options. So you could buy renewable, but potential for everything is limited. So it is definitely going to be challenging, and only through advanced planning can companies be able to meet their own net zero targets in the way that is required to be done. So planning is extremely important.
Sagari, anything else that
is highly impacted by policies. If the government helps us set up solar panels, we will then place them on our rooftops and we will provide to the grid. If renewable energy is available, we will invest in it. I've just been reading his book, Aspirational Investor, which is about investing where your human values are. So we can start doing that. At the individual level, as I said, India is a treasure house for that.
This was a very intense discussion. We hope this discussion would have brought you greater clarity about net zero and the related challenges. And in his national statement at the recently concluded COP26, US President Joe Biden said, "None of us can escape the worst that's yet to come if we fail to seize the moment." Hopefully, we will seize this moment and achieve this target as planned. Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, Ms. Sagari Chhabra, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure.
In our national program of talks tonight, you were listening to a panel discussion entitled Net Zero and Global Warming. The panelists were Sagari Chhabra, acclaimed filmmaker and author, Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, Fellow, Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and Ravi Kumar, media personality who initiated and moderated this discussion. Produced and presented by Naveen K. Gupta of All India Radio Delhi, this program came to you from the Delhi station of All India Radio.